In a typical science fashion, we have a wealth of data from all of you collected, so I can lie about statistics if you like, but I'll go ahead and just start off with the panelists and let them know what the results of our extremely scientific research was. Most of the people who answered in the audience said that entanglement in some form was their biggest concern, followed by the unknowns regarding unknown bycatch, what's happening out there, and things that aren't monitored. Resource competition, noise, and communication, that being conveying the information to fishermen, fishermen communicating back to scientists, sort of being tied to the last one. Does that come as a surprise to any of you who would like to comment on that? No? It's not a surprise to anybody. All right.
Well, it's not a surprise considering the general topic this morning, but I'm not surprised that some of those other concerns were listed and are probably worth exploring maybe in future workshops. And I know some of the sound stuff will probably be touched on.
Okay. I will mark that down as a possible recommendation for future workshops.
And one thing that we didn't hear about is the bycatch of small cetaceans in coastal fisheries worldwide. I think that the U.S. has a much better handle on bycatch issues, and they've actually, in most places, eliminated gill nets that are really near shore where the probability of catching marine mammals are really high, but that isn't true for the rest of the world. And there's been estimates that around 300,000 small cetaceans are captured in gill nets each year. And so these are really where the conservation threats are, and we didn't hear very much about that this morning.
In California, you're not allowed to fish with gill nets within 3 miles of the beach. And above point conception, you're not allowed to fish within 15 fathoms.
David?
Yeah, just to disagree with Jay a little bit, a tiny bit. Actually, no, I agree. Some of the biggest conservation issues we know of are with the small cetaceans, but as I mentioned, with the large ones, we just don't know. And what every place we begin to investigate, we're seeing that it's a much higher level because the observer programs don't see the large whale entanglements. The large whales take the gear off and it's just lost. But as far as populations, yeah, but there are a couple of large whale populations at risk, like the western gray whale population and the Arabian sea humpbacks, and probably some of the right whales, but certainly not like the Kita went down like that.
Before we leave this question, I'd like to open it up to the audience if anybody would like to comment or ask a question about sort of the results of our unsophisticated scientific experiment, saying that entanglement based on our talks this morning seems to be the greatest concern for the folks out here in this community. Does anybody have a question on that? Would you like to ask the panel or a comment? Francis?
Did you get much comment about prey depletion as distinct from entanglement in other parts of the world, like in the southern oceans or? I mean, nobody cared about prey depletion?
Yeah, I think somebody mentioned it. You had mentioned it.
Yeah.
I didn't have my colleagues.
I forgot to follow directions.
Yeah. Actually, somebody who was planning to be here but isn't, Jeff Moore, is actually working on a paper on prey depletion, and he's actually using African mammals as an example, where if you deplete the prey base by, say, 50%, what will happen to the carnivores that feed on that prey base? And the answer is they will decline, not by 50%, but he's trying to work out what that ratio is and whether there's a standard percentile of trophic cascade that you can expect. And but very little research has been done on that so far.
One thing along that line, something that came up there, and just wondering if people had mentioned it, was, you're talking about communication between fishermen and the regulators. Wondering also, how much do those areas of science touch each other, knowing that previously there's been criticism of single species models for fisheries and things like that. Nowadays we're starting to see more than one species in a model. But also this idea now that maybe the management of the prey and the management of their predators, there should be some interaction among those people that are working on those, and so are stock assessments and shared between actual fish that are being fished and marine mammals that are being managed, because in theory, there's part of that web there that ought to be talking back and forth.
Yeah, I think that would certainly be a more holistic way of managing things. Unfortunately, we tend to compartmentalize management between Magnuson fisheries issues and ESA and MMPA protected species issues. Often, we work within several offices of each other, so we could do a better job of that integration.
And one of the comments that we got also was more how do we get the fishermen that are out there on a daily basis talking with the researchers that are studying the species that they're seeing every day. As we heard from Arthur, I mean, he's got a wealth of knowledge. It's they're the naturalists that are out there every day. And we've got the research on how do we foster that type of communication, amongst ourselves and with them. So that was a comment that also came up as well as part of the communication that we need to get better at. Craig?
Follow up on the communication thread. I think one of the elements that I think would improve the level of discourse is just celebrate the successes that we've been having in the U.S. fisheries in terms of sustainable management, bycatch reduction, the cost that these fishermen bear in carrying observers, not fishing in areas, versus the rhetoric we hear about fishing in general and how fishermen are painted with a broad brush across the landscape of their interactions. Importing about 80% of our seafood in the U.S. We have lots of whale entanglements and interactions that are taking place outside the U.S., but buying that product and importing it into the U.S. Has a cost. So I think if we can, maybe in the future of this workshop, talk about a panel on how to, not only celebrate those successes, but export that technology to help the bycatch program. I think we then recognize the accomplishments that we've made, both on the fishermen and the research and in the management and conservation end.
Yeah, our take reduction team has pretty much spread pingers throughout the world. And the manufacture of pingers now, they're mainly manufactured in Australia. The Fumunda was bought out by an Australian, I forgot his name, an entrepreneur. He's pretty well to do, and he really liked what Stanley did with the Fumunda pingers. That spread into the Mediterranean. The French are using them now, and that all came out of the take reduction team that we're on.
And we did, as a means of outreach and educating the public, we did just last year complete a DVD that highlights sustainable fishing and highlights this drift gillnet fishery. And we did want to show it, but given the time, we're going to probably try and show it at the maybe 15 minutes before the session after lunch starts. So I encourage a lot of you to take a look at it. And then one more point on the importation of fish. The U.S. right now is considering regulations that will ban the importation of fish by countries that do not use the same standards for reducing marine mammal bycatch in their fisheries. So that's in process right now. We'll see. I think it'll be difficult to identify nations like that do not have standards in place for marine mammal bycatch reduction, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Is there any, are there any numbers associated with that? Do you happen to know? In other words, what percentage of import might that affect? More than half or something of that nature?
I don't know. I think it originally had started out as a ban on swordfish importation, and it's now all fish. So just certifying a country I think it's just going to be difficult anyway. But I don't have any idea, especially given that it's a lot of species of fish, any species of fish.
Plus, for large whales, again, it's really, most countries say, well, we don't have a problem. We just get 1 or 2 reports a year, and that's, of course, what we used to, 20 years ago, that's what we had along our coast, and then we began to look at it more. But now the position I'm in of going out to try to do this capacity building, which countries are going to want to find out that they have a problem? It's going to be a challenge. But the U.S., I think we're exporting that. That's part of what I'm doing, and these other things that are exporting our expertise to hopefully help globally.
I have a question for Art. There's two fisheries working side by side. One, his fishery, which is the thresher shark and swordfish fishery that uses pingers, and then there's the white sea bass fishery, which, as far as I know, fishermen are not commonly using pingers. I'm just wondering, how would you suggest going about trying to get fishermen to voluntarily use pingers where they're not legally mandated to do so right now?
Well, it would be nice if we could let his data come out and let the guys know that the sea lions, it's not so much of a dinner bell, you know, because these guys with the coastal fisheries are fishing basically right outside 3 miles, and they're fishing the islands and stuff. And once they realize, once they get some of your information, then most of the guys, they have the pingers. You know, most of them are involved in both fisheries. I'd say at least 65–70% of them have the pingers already and wouldn't mind using them, but they, you know, they've seen what the sea lion does to the swordfish, and they do the same thing to the sea bass too. They'll swim down the net and take every, you know, they'll take, and they won't eat every fish, but they'll ruin every fish. They'll take the middle out of this one, the middle out of that one, and just, they'll swim down it until they pick everything out of the net, and the guy will have nothing. So it's pretty hard to talk them into putting on a dinner bell.
I have one more question for Art. Sorry to keep asking you questions here, but in terms of communication with the fishermen and using your knowledge, I was very impressed with the thing you said about what you're seeing out there. Have you actually seen any entangled whales? Like, have you seen a whale with gear on it?
Oh, yes.
So what would be an incentive, or how would it make you feel more comfortable to report those kind of things? Or would you not even consider it?
You know, I've been in the water with them. And I've untangled them myself. And I've risked my life to do it. And there's, I don't know. You know, if there was a way that you could possibly get to the whale and untangle it, yes, it would be worth, you know, reporting. But if you're 150 miles offshore and the thing's dragging a buoy, it's pretty hard to get up next to him. He knows. That's what he does. Like, were you the people that were based in Moss Landing for a little while?
A colleague and I think Ed or Sarah did the training there, some of the training.
Yeah,
it's Jim Harvey's group, though.
Jim Harvey, is the group. But I'd like to talk to you about getting in the water. We have some ways to not do that, but that could be pretty simple. But that's a sidebar conversation.
We actually have a video that we can show at the lunch too.
No,
One of the things I wanted to comment on with regard to that question about how to better access the information that the fishermen are getting and being out on the water every day is, I think, some system that doesn't require more reporting. Or I wondered, Arthur, if you would agree. I think that there's, you know, if there was more of a, if the proactivity was on the scientist side, reaching out to fishermen, and you find, you know, the fishermen who are interested in sharing what they're seeing and make regular contacts.
There's more and more of us that want to get involved with, you know, after meeting Jay and John over here and Tina, and it's more and more of us are starting to want to get involved. There's a few fishermen that have been to these meetings and seen that all these guys aren't going to want to burn crosses in our yard. When you're introduced to somebody from National Marine Fisheries, and the first thing that happens is you're not fishing anymore, it's really hard to change your opinion of that. You know, it's like if you had to take an observer home and take all the doors off your house and you're not allowed any privacy, and you have somebody you've never met before go spend 5 days with you.
Just on that reporting too, there's some pretty big, there's a lot of discussion of that, of the fear of either just a fine for the individual fishermen or a fear of regulation of the fishery, and how can we get around that so we get the good information? Because there are some countries that have very high reporting, of course, because they're not only, as long as they report, they're allowed to keep it. So some of the Asian countries, you see high reporting of the bycatch because there's incentive to do it. In other countries, most other countries, there's either no knowledge of what to do, or there's actual disincentive to report. It's a problem.
Is that for active fishing gear, like a guy with a gill net, where you would actually know that a whale was in gear versus, trap gear where it's left out?
Yes, yeah. I mean, Korea's got very, very good reporting. People could argue whether there's, well, I won't get into it.
Korea also has a lot of IUU.
Yeah, exactly. But their entanglements are in the same suite of gear that we would see here: pot gear, gill net gear, set net gear.
I saw 2 hands raised. We'll take those and then move on to a different topic.
So along those lines, just a question about the you're talking about going ahead and cutting whales free. There are probably, or what we hear in some cases is there's some fishermen who feel like because this represents competition, that actually for them, that's not necessarily a negative event to have an eliminated whale, sea lion, or whatever. I was wondering what percentage of people are like that, because actually, to take it slightly outside the zone right now, in Hawaii we have a problem with the fact that monk seals, which number a very small number, we still hear from fishermen about how they really don't like to have them around, and they prefer to see the number even smaller because they represent competition. And this is a population of the main Hawaiian Islands of 130 animals, and that's still considered a threat. So how many people you think have that kind of attitude versus the other one that would actually like to see marine mammal populations be healthy out there? Are they considered competition for you?
Sea lions in California? There's, as far as I'm concerned, there should be a bounty on them. There's way more than there should be. We've opened up these marine protected areas now, and all they're going to be is feeding grounds for the sea lions. They're not going to, anytime there's anything that's there, they're going to devastate it. There's a lot of them. I think PBR on them to reach 1% is over 8,000 animals. So a year. And so there's, that is heavy competition. The guys that fish with the smaller boats probably lose $10,000 to $15,000 worth of product a year from the sea lions devastating. As far as marine mammals, the longliners have a bit of a problem with the sperm whales now up in Alaska. They're going down the long lines, and the guys just can't pull. When the whales are there, the guys can't pull. They clamp onto the line and they just pull it right through. They're like boom, 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 every fish. And they're smart animals to be able to do that.
With regard to partnering with fishermen, I've found in my experience that the folks that are having difficulties with pinnipeds are more than willing to step up to the plate and get involved with looking at deterrence. They invite us out on their boats. They fork over the bills for gas. They go through all of that. And it's not a formal take her out this team sort of effort. It's just trying to work together to do that. So fostering that partnership. It kind of stems from the level of frustration, though. Certainly from the fisherman's side, to want to try to get to the bottom of a way to be able to fish and be able to fish as much as they can without having their catch damaged from the animals, yet still respect the fact that the animals are there. So we've had a lot of success with that, but it's really been word of mouth and just individuals contacting individuals to make that happen. So.
Not only that, I don't think the fishermen are afraid of how many animals did you say that were there?
About 130 in the main.
I don't think, there might be 1 or 2 old timers that are still mad at them, but I don't think the rest of the fishermen are.
So I have another question for our panel. Are you aware of any successful preventative measures, say for large whales in particular, but for any marine mammal species from the region or elsewhere that might have broader relevance throughout the region, nationally, internationally?
Well,
David posed this question, so.
Yeah.
there was a, not on large whales, but on small whales, there was a talk at the Marine Mammal Conference in Tampa in December by a group in the UK that was looking at a new type of pinger that puts out a highly aversive sound that was actually very effective at discouraging harbor seals from depredating salmon pens. And pinnipeds are really hard to discourage, and these were able to discourage the animals for an extended period of time. And it's not using a much louder sound, which has been the sort of the American approach, bigger, but using a sound that was better tailored to be aversive to the animals. And I think that has some potential locally and internationally as well.
I have a question for you. Has there been any research on using a pinger that's got lower decibels for the larger whales and stuff?
Yeah, that was mentioned. The Australians are doing experiments with this 3 kilohertz pinger, and the early reports I've heard is that it's from the manufacturer, admittedly, was that it seemed to be reducing, actually deterring the humpback whales from the shark nets in Australia.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah, it's made by Famundo. So
Yeah,
I've got one. Actually,
Yeah, you did.
Yeah.
Just to answer my own question a little bit. I mentioned for large whales the dropping of the floating line between, in the east we actually, or in the Atlantic, the thought, when we first talked to the lobster fishermen, they said, oh no, we pull it tight, it doesn't go very high in the water column, but there's this bounce back, and so the lines between their traps were going way up into the water. And so that was a significant reduction of rope in the water column, and now what they're working on is trying to reduce the vertical lines or decrease the number of vertical lines by maybe putting more traps on a line, that kind of thing. So those are they've also tried weak links, but we don't have any evidence yet whether that's really worked or not.
Now, don't the guys splice chain or leads in the lines to keep the lines tight? And on the bottom?
You mean the vertical lines?
The vertical lines and the other lines?
They use, most of them, for what I know, use just a sinking line for the buoy line, so that keeps it vertical. But it doesn't, I don't think any of them are tight enough they don't seem tight enough to prevent an accident.
Now, when we fished rock cod, we'd take and we'd splice chunks of chain into the rope so that the line was always tight, yet the buoys would float it if the current got too strong. You would be able to pull it off the bottom and pull it tight.
And the reason you wanted a tight line was, what was the reason?
To keep other boats from running. You don't like the line coiled up at the top at all.
Yeah, no, I think it seems to work for them just using sinking line. That appears to work.
So based on some of the talks we heard this morning, there seems to be a general pattern of fishing and whale distribution that's known. I mean, there's some obvious gaps, certainly, seasonally, year-round, that kind of information. But what would you recommend to guide future research at a finer scale? And I'd like to hear some thoughts on how we could guide collaborative efforts to get at that data between fishermen and researchers, and perhaps talk about that and maybe come up with some recommendations for future. And I'll open that up to the panel first.
I'll take this for now. I like to think that some of the outcomes of my research could actually lead to some field work, maybe, like the areas that we have high overlap or predicted high overlap of gear and whales, and maybe do like a real-time study of looking at maybe doing a buoy count of how many buoys are there at the same time of keeping track of the whales in the area. So maybe something like that would be a fine-scale hotspot. But I don't know how that would incorporate the fishermen, but I certainly think that they are a valuable resource that we definitely need to tap into.
One of the things that that's been proposed by a number of people and is maybe gaining some traction, but it is really, those of us that have been dealing with this realize that the fishermen are the best problem solvers about this. Whenever they got a problem with how to fish, they can figure it out. And the thought is, instead of going to just flat closures in say a marine protected area, and this is going to be a little controversial, instead of going to closures, leave it only open to fishermen that are going to experiment with gear that has a reasonable belief to be, whale or entanglement safe. In other words, maybe gear with no buoy lines. How could people do fish that way in some places around the world? But let the create the environment in which the fishermen can solve the problem.
I was just going to say essentially the same thing, that probably the best place to go to look for new designs for gear or that kind of thing would be the fishermen themselves. And I know just yesterday when meeting with our contract divers, they were talking about some of the techniques the kind of bad seeds or the stealth lobster fishermen are using to hide their buoys below the surface. And they're just using zincs that'll pop up the buoy after a few days so that they can find it. Well, couldn't that same very simple technology be used to somehow minimize the entanglement hazard of at least, maybe a trap or something that was up in the water for too long, keep that rope from basically flagging in the water column, maybe, anyway, my point being that the fishermen are really great at devising designs for gear that work for fishing and could probably do the same for reducing entanglement and traveling hazards.
Pop-up tags are illegal, or at least, and
well, of course they are. That's why I call them stealth fishing.
Well, and that is the problem with with a lot of that kind of buoyless or fishing gear is that then the managers can't manage. Right. Enforcement doesn't know where people are, but it also could be in some areas people are probably going to be moving towards spatial planning and maybe certain grounds that are off limits to anything but this kind of gear, that kind of thing. Somewhere down the road, that may be how you get around that.
I have a friend who works at World Wildlife Fund in San Francisco, and you guys are all aware, I'm sure probably, but they promoted a contest this year where they had a monetary reward for the best new invention for avoiding potential bycatch fisheries. And has that been very successful? Do you know? Or?
I know. I think that started with a right whale issue in the Atlantic, and I know they've come up with some interesting ideas like lipophilic line that would dissolve if it became wrapped around the whale, or But so far, I'm not aware of. I don't know, Randy, or you're in the audience. I don't know. I'm not aware of anything that's come out of it, but it does generate some interesting ideas.
Yeah, there seems to be some initiatives that.
Seems like if the impediment, for instance, with this white sea bass fishery is that the fishermen don't want a potential dinner bell, perhaps the fishermen could partner with a conservation organization that would agree to buy all of the damaged fish. And so if it were a risk to the fisherman, who's a small businessman just trying to get by, if they could have their damaged fish paid for, then they'd be a lot more willing to do an experiment. And if that experiment showed that there was no dinner bell effect, say, for California sea lions, then that technology might be more readily adopted by the fishermen. And if the fishermen are part of the project to test it, then they might be a lot more believing of the results.
And I think some of what this gets at is the questions about behaviors and entanglement. And Dave, maybe you can speak to this, but for the experiences I've had with large whale entanglement, they look a little different depending upon your species. Like we seem to have, humpbacks seem to get it first in the mouth as they've got their mouth open and they're cruising sideways through the water column, and then they go through a roll and they wrap it around themselves and then they take off with your crab pot or something like that. Whereas something like a gray whale is probably scrubbing around on the bottom and may get into it in a different fashion. I mean, this is just me surmising from what I've seen. But there may be ways then to start looking at things that would say they seem to get entangled in this way because of this behavior. What can we do to work with that? And I think the same question could come up with California sea lions. How do they depredate? Why are they attracted to it? Is there some way to actually short circuit that behavior, get around it, or just make it less likely that that behavior will succeed? And so these things may be actually requiring a little more behavioral biology, but something that could then allow us to get into the insight of why the animals and how the animals get into these interactions in the first place.
Sea lions do it because they're smart and it's the easiest way to feed.
Well, you are aggregating the food for them.
Yeah.
Who pays for the pingers and how much do they cost?
They're $100 a piece and I buy my own. Everybody, the fishermen buy them.
So it's a significant expense then?
Yes, I have $6,000 worth of them.
So what I'm hearing from this discussion is that it sounds like what we need to do as a scientific community, along with the fishermen, is perhaps figure out an effective way to get the right people talking with one another, involving the fishermen in the research, involving the researchers in the fishing. And so I sort of jotted that down, and we can maybe flesh that out a little bit as far as a recommendation on how to make that happen. That's not, say, a formal take reduction team, process. It's not, but somewhat perhaps modeled after that as far as getting the right people at the table. So I've jotted that down as far as that goes. Karen?
Yeah, I want to follow up. I want to, first of all, echo the sentiment that fishermen are usually the best source for solutions because they're very creative, and I think partnering is really key in a lot of these cases. But one thing that we've run into over and over again is this issue that Jay mentioned of the perception. If you catch one vaquita every 10 years, how could it possibly be a problem? And in many cases where we do have management issues with marine mammals, particularly the dolphins and porpoises or whales, those are really rare events. And even getting fishermen to agree that this is something that needs to be paid attention to is difficult. And I know that often it's come down to us, having a meeting with fishermen face to face, saying, this is the PBR, this is our estimate, like it or not, and it exceeds it, and therefore trust us, there is a problem. But Arthur, again, I'm sorry, we're all thinking you have tremendous insight that we really got nothing.
It's hard to believe, that when you tell me there's so many animals here and that's all there is, and I'm in the 150 block and I see a water break that you can smell the squid on, you see the birds picking on it, and you see 40 or 50 sperm whales cruising up and down it, and you're telling me there's only so many of these animals. The same year, I'm outside Cortez and it looks like Moby Dick. The same thing, they're all over the place, and we see a lot more of them than you do.
Yeah, and do you have any suggestions? I could come up with 2 or 3 reasons, why that is.
There's a thing, I should be carrying a nice camera on my boat, and I don't. And that's something that's not going to happen again. I'm not going to go out to sea without a nice camera, because nobody here will believe what I say.
Just post it to YouTube and everybody in the world will know.
Yeah, I totally believe you, Arthur, and I think it's a part of the whole process that you guys are going where the productive spots are, and that's where all the predators are going too. We're predators kind of as humans, and so are they, and it makes sense that you would all converge in the same place. If we want to go grocery shopping, we all end up at the grocery store, not in the parking lot. And so that process isn't that surprising to me. Also, there are a lot of different kinds of dolphins, and as scientists we make distinctions between things that look virtually identical if you see them on the water, but they are in fact different species. And is there, do you see any way to open up those communications channels to help?
We have to carry good digital cameras on the boat, and that's one of the things I'll start working with, because I see, down here they're really shy right whale porpoise. You hardly ever see them on the bow, but up north they're the size of football fields. Yeah. And they're on everybody's bow, not, a guy 10 miles away has the same thing that you have. And we just look at it and, it's a beautiful thing, and that's it, we go back to work.
There's another session here on photogrammetry here, and it almost sounds to me like we need to have maybe a training workshop for fishermen that are willing to go out there with a camera.
I think that would be a great
to take
idea.
pictures to add to this photo ID work that's happening, and vice versa. Maybe have the training for researchers to learn a little bit more about fishing, so that when we get this behavioral aspect of the behaviorist understanding fishing practices, and might get a clue on with regard to reducing that.
Maybe a program could provide cameras too. There might be a way that that could be done.
Barb? Yeah, I'm curious of one of the statements that David made very early on, where they actually estimated mortality rates from entanglement, pod entanglement. Now, we're not talking about gill nets. And then later on, we were hearing about, how there's, class 1, class 2, class 3 type fisheries. But we don't really see that with the pot fisheries so much as with gill nets, where we have observers out there. At least there wasn't any discussion of how that might be done, or how we might get to quantifying whether there is a problem or not with pot fisheries. I think that's a real difference between the gill net type fisheries and small cetaceans, and the line entanglement issues with the large cetaceans, is that ability to estimate whether or not there is a problem there is essentially more difficult. And so I'm interested in hearing what the panelists have to say about how can we better quantify what the actual death rate is to large whales. And of course, from my personal perspective, it has to go beyond that and give you some idea about how it's impacting particular stocks, like the Pacific Coast feeding group of gray whales versus all gray whales. So anyway, I just thought I'm interested in how that was done and how it might be
Well, the estimate that I put up of about 3%, that's at 2 to 4%, was based on annual surveys of the humpback population in the Gulf of Maine for tailstock wounds, and with certain assumptions made about healing times and all that, so that, and so basically looking at the animals that had new wounds but had survived, and then using, over the past decade or so, fisheries, the National Marine Fisheries Service has been developing a sort of a survival rate for entangled whales. And so in essence what you know is this is the numbers of animals that have survived, so how many must have died if you have use the same ratio, simplistically put. But as far as what kind of gear, the thing is in the Gulf of Maine it is mostly, or it's a lot of the gill netting is no longer going on. It's like I said, 3 million lobster traps. It's mostly popular. But I don't know if that helps you. But the SCAR studies can help get some insight, but it's pretty tough. There are a lot of them.
The California lobster fishery is a completely different fishery than the East Coast fishery. The California lobster fishery is mainly the surf line, just outside the surf line, so they don't have as much interactions with the larger whales like that. Every now and then they might get into the gray whale population, might swim through the pier, but they're mainly in the kelp. It's the California pot fisheries. And then they have the Dungeness crab fishery, which is based above Point Conception, from Point Conception to the Straits of Juan de Fuca. And that's mainly an inshore fishery too. And in Maine, aren't they fishing quite a ways offshore?
Both.
Different shell. They have a much different shell.
Yeah. There's offshore, and it's seasonal too. The lobster shipped offshore in the winter. But just a quick thing on pot gear in the Pacific. What we've been pulling off the whales in Hawaii is mostly pot gear from Alaska. We don't have any whales with gill net in any humpback whales in Hawaii, but we think they're just not surviving that far.
To answer the first part of your question, in terms of categories in our trout fisheries, Oregon and Washington Dungeness crab is category 2. The spot prawn fishery is category 2 because of a confirmed humpback entanglement. And might be one more, maybe it's stablefish.
That, where that humpback was entangled, they're no longer fishing shrimp there, it's closed.
This brings up an interesting point that I heard a little bit throughout the presentations, and we're hearing about now, is that there seems to be this distinction between reporting when fishermen are on site. What I want to say is actively fishing, because I know that fishing practices are different. You know, sometimes you set your gear, you come back, but you're still actively fishing. But an actual report of seeing an entangled whale in your gear is very, very few. Also, entanglements and any interaction with gear is few. Anyway, so there seems to be this distinction between that and, say, passive or lost gear. Does the panel feel or have any opinion with regard to perhaps focus or priority on what, from a scientific standpoint, we should look at research-wise? Should we be concentrating more on sort of passive? Is that what seems to be more of an interaction versus some of these active ones? Or
when I use the term passive, I meant static gear, not lost gear. So or fixed gear. I mean, people in different parts of the world use different terminologies.
right.
But passive, fixed also implies anchored, and so there's drift, which is passive. You know, but I would say we really don't know much about, as we've learned about the true lost gear and the impact. It has some, probably, in some places. But
Yeah, I'm thinking of those sort of in two different realms as well. Lost gear being gear that's lost, but sort of the, I guess I'm having a hard time describing it, but sort of the passive fishing where the fisherman is not necessarily on top of the gear at that time. It seems to me that is a gap in knowledge with regard to, particularly in California where we don't have a lot of ID, so to speak, versus having the fishermen right on site, seeing an animal get entangled, or an observer, say, on site, entangled. I'm seeing and I'm hearing from most of the folks here on the panel that seems to be a big unknown with regard to the type of gear or the gear that's on these animals. Because it's, you know, just from talking with fishermen, I mean, if an animal was entangled, you know, for the most part it gets reported.
I think if we were going to have observers on a trap fishery, the likelihood of them actually observing anything is slim to none, so it would almost not be worth the money to put observers out.
For mammal.
For marine mammal,
yeah.
yes, thank you.
I
Large
mean,
whales.
At some level, you probably also have to use, you know, go by analogy and take data. I mean, we've been looking at pulling data from around the world and then saying, well, you know, like I said, in Korea, there's very good data. So about minke whales, anyway, minke whale entanglement in pot gear and all of that. So you with a fairly high sample size, you begin to see. I think that can help inform us to some degree.
What kind of pot gear do they use?
I think fish pots, crustacean. I don't know the exact kind of. We're hopefully going to be getting a better idea of that. Korean scientists is going to become doing a savannah. So
then most of the whales that you see in Hawaii, then they come from Alaska, so that's probably peacock or.
A lot of it seems to be the Bering Sea stuff. I don't know the heavy.
They fish pot cod.
Yeah, pot cod or crab, depending on the season. Right?
I mean, the crab boats are only allowed. There's only so many crab boats in there.
We've also had a gray whale that brought crab gear down from Alaska that we've seen off in California. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think of concern, of course, are gill nets and pot and trap, but I think we've made our first step with having Lauren start to characterize that because we really did not know how those fishermen were fishing. Were they stringing them? Were they single pots? That sort of thing. Just getting a sense of that. We did it in anticipation of possibly putting together a take reduction team for the pot trap fishery, and so just because we had concerns with tailor humpback whales, but by Lauren going up and down the coast, talking to fishermen, looking at the gear herself, taking pictures of it, and understanding just how that gear is fished in the water is just our first step in seeing what type of solutions might be possible to reduce the entanglement. That's probably our next, our next step.
Allison's had her hand raised.
A few examples of this have already been said in addition to what Christina just mentioned, but for those of us that don't work for NIMS or are a fisherman, can you give just kind of a brief summary of what communication already exists between NIMS and fishermen that isn't the knock on the door that says your fishery is closed, but that happens before that step?
We have the workshops and stuff with our fishery that when we first started them, we had them every year. We had them every year, so we'd get refresher courses on what the rules were, how to install pingers, and we had new pingers developed, and I was one of the guys that showed the guys how to install them into the nets so that they were permanently affixed and you didn't have, my net has the pingers on them all the time. They turn on when they're in the water and they turn off when you wind them back up and they dry out. And we showed the fishermen that didn't know that these were available, We showed them how to untangle things if you do get something in the net. And the workshops now are for new entries into the fisheries. Then all the new entries that haven't been to any of the workshops they have to call National Marine Fisheries and go to one.
And does that happen across most of the different types of fisheries in the region, or just?
No, just with the swordfish drift net fishery.
We have one longline fisherman that comes in for training as well. In some cases, it's mandated through whatever means we have, either through a biological opinion that will have looked at a fishery and then mandate that skipper workshops take place. But we also have, and I know the state has, and maybe Lauren can talk to this about the Pacific States Fishery Commission has port samplers that will go and talk to fishermen and collect information from their logbooks, and so there's a sort of a dialogue as well that takes place there.
I don't think they're talking about entanglement, though.
Right. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think to answer your question, I mean, it really comes down to the individuals who are working on the issue, going and talking to fishermen and vice versa. I get a phone call from someone who's having an issue, and that's how the dialogue gets started. But nothing really formal and nothing really easy, I guess. Just having someone pick up the phone or make the effort, a real consolidated area where we know that someone's doing research on this, or some fishery is having this, or something like that hasn't really been put together yet. Craig?
There is actually a formal process through the Pacific Councils. All the fishery management councils have advisory sub-panels that have fishermen, processors, environmental groups. So there's dialogue that goes on there. And one of the challenges I think you started to touch upon with communication is not just fishermen and researchers, but it's conservation groups, it's politicians. California is a very difficult place to do business in a lot of ways, whether you're a fisherman or even doing research. So in the past, we've had initiatives to look at the sea lion depredation problem, for example, and Coastal Conservancy voted down the research to do that. We even had, on our own federal level, projects that were in place that were voted down at different levels. So I think if you're going to have that dialogue, you need to bring in those user groups early in the process and combine.
Yeah, I was curious, when you do have some type of advance in fisheries that will reduce bycatch, is there anything in place to help roll that out to fishermen? There's a significant expense, as our group was saying, and it seems to me that in some of the situations when you're looking at things like, say, monk seals or about we want to get that out as soon as possible. Is there anything in place to try to help roll that out when such things occur?
No.
I think there is in some fisheries. I don't know. I think, but I suspect it's probably less true than I think we're understanding. But I think it may depend for the Kita there. I think there was a little buyouts and rent outs and.
And were the buyouts working?
The buyouts bought out probably the least productive fishermen, the ones that were marginally making it, but they did not buy out the ones that were.
That's usually what buyouts buy out, are the people that aren't making it.
I may be wrong, but I think there was some financial assistance with the switch over from floating to sinking line. Not with the state of Massachusetts, which went first and pioneered it, but then I think that later on, when they went sort of coastwide, there was financial assistance.
Something that we should.
I you know, I probably should. I vaguely remember hearing that at the latest TRT, but
Yeah, I remember hearing that too. I just can't remember if it was federal or private.
I know that some conservation groups have jumped in places like, they pioneered the lost gear retrieval with the fishermen in Massachusetts, and so they help financially with that.
I think they're actually taking some lost gear and doing collection and turning it into energy, like renewable energy. So really doing full circle.
So we have a few minutes left. Go ahead, John.
So on the south coast, we've just had a whole sequence of marine protected areas go into effect. And I was wondering whether the idea is that because those areas are closed, the effort will go down, or will the effort just be displaced to other areas? And if it is, then what impact might that have on bycatch?
Effort will be shifted.
If we were doing speed talks, I had a nice little slide that showed exactly how there are these nice right whale protected areas, and the feeding right whale is completely out around it, and the fishing gear just shifts outside. It just displaces. Now, if you really get a hot spot protected area and you protect, obviously you're going to have some impact, but it doesn't. I don't think, from everything I've heard around the world, it doesn't really decrease the effort. It just shifts it.
But specifically for our south coast, has anybody thought through, because for instance, you were saying, Arthur, that a lot of the line, the trap air is in the shallow water, which is where these MPAs are.
Yes.
So that's going to shift it somewhere else.
Yeah, you're just basically saying, okay, you can't have any stores here. So they're gonna put their stores there, people are gonna make a living. And there's, fishermen are small businesses. And that's what the man does for a living. Now he can't do it there no more. He's been doing it there his whole life. Now he has to go invade somebody else's area where they've been doing it all their whole life. And it's going to cause friction between fishermen. It's going to cause a lot of friction between fishermen because you got guys that have been fishing in these MPAs for 20 years. Now there's not, you could buy them out, but how do you realistically buy somebody out? For somebody to buy me out of the swordfish fishery, they'd have to give me $1 million to make it tax-free to where I could put that $1 million in my retirement and go, okay, there you go, I won't fish swordfish anymore. Because that's what I gross every 10 years. I don't take that home. For every dollar that I make, $7 goes into the community that I'm fishing out of.
So it's lunchtime, and before we finish up, I just want to go through a couple things very quickly. I heard from the audience and from our panel that a couple of recommendations. I think probably the main one that I've heard that everything can sort of step on is somehow developing a program to facilitate the communication between stakeholders that are involved. Whether it's having trainings or workshops or smaller working groups or something like that to facilitate this type of discussion. I foresee in the future perhaps making a smaller subject matter stemming from these larger ones for next session, perhaps for next year, and going with that. And of course, gleaning from all of the folks here on this panel the best way to form partnerships. And so before we let everybody go, I just want to give the panelists an opportunity to say one last thing if they'd like to the group regarding recommendations or partnerships or anything else. Lauren, you can start down there with you.
I'm packed.
I think my recommendation would be the one I hoped I hinted at the end of my short presentation, which is just that the more that we're working with and involving fishermen in the solutions, I think the more successful these programs are going to be. That's in very general terms, but I think it is the way to go.
And I would just say that, to expand on that, the more that we work, we may stay focused locally, but if we work collaboratively, nationally, internationally, we can learn from each other as well.
I'd rather grill a faux pas in Art's backyard than burn a cross in his front yard.
I think these should be made more public to the industry itself. You know, if there were more people that knew these were going on, I think, and I'll let them know it's a little more friendlier than we thought.
Thank you.
I think just what we're trying to do and increase our outreach and education even to the public to broaden their knowledge of their local fishermen and their fishery, and that's what we were trying to do with this DVD, so please, that's a plug to watch it.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
Yeah, and we should let it be known that the American fisheries, we deliver the cleanest fish there is in the world. I mean, our fish, we fish with more regulations than any other country in the world. We're setting a standard for the rest of the world. And for them to look at us and see that our fisheries are just shut down and closed, well, do you think they'll follow step?
Jim, you're silent.
Shockingly.
I spoke once. Yeah, I think, I've been to a lot of meetings where you have a token fisherman in the room at, sort of a science-themed meeting. I think we need to go to the fishermen more, so it should be more of a two-way street. We can enter, into the fishing community and just ask their opinion and get
It's a
advice
lot
from
easier to
them.
get into now. It's way smaller than it used to be.
That's it.
Well, I want to thank everybody for our experiments, our speed talks. I know that was really a challenge for all of our speakers, and I think they did a fantastic job getting the information out to the group. I'd like to thank Lauren and Kirsten and David and Jay and Arthur and Tina and Jim for sitting through this and helping us get somewhere. We will try to show those DVDs at the end towards the end of lunch, so while you're eating dessert, we'll have them up playing. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura.